in Genesis 45:16 through chapter 47. So we're going to go kind of quickly today as we get through. This is after Joseph has been reunited with his brothers, and we're going to see what happens. So starting in verse 16 of chapter 45. When the report was heard in Pharaoh's house, Joseph's brothers have come, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, say to your brothers, do this, load your beasts and go back to the land of Canaan, and take your father and your households and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you shall eat the fat of the land. And you, Joseph, are commanded to say, do this, and take wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and come. Have no concern for your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. The sons of Israel did so, and Joseph gave them wagons, according to the command of Pharaoh, and gave them provisions for the journey. To each and all of them he gave a change of clothes, but to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 changes of clothes. To his father he sent as follows: 10 donkeys loaded with the good things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain, bread, and provision for his father on the journey. And then he sent his brothers away, and as they departed, he said to them, do not quarrel on the way. So they went up out of Egypt and came to the land of Canaan to their father Jacob. And they told him, Joseph is still alive, and he is ruler over all the land of Egypt. And his heart became numb, for he did not believe them. But when they told him all the words of Joseph, which he had said to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And Israel said, it is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. So Joseph's brothers were promised the best of the land. They came to Egypt to avoid dying of hunger, and now they'll leave with Pharaoh's promise of abundance. And what I think is so cool is that God answered a prayer that they may never have prayed. I mean, they might have prayed for food, right, because they were hungry. But did they pray, Lord, help us find food and heal our family, give us our brother back, have Pharaoh invite us to live in Egypt, and promise us all the best of the land of Egypt? Probably not, right? And this is a good reminder. How big is your prayer life? Are you praying a prayer as big as your God? I know that in my life, I can let cynicism limit my prayers, but I want to be better about praying big prayers. So now looking back at these verses, look at the mention of clothes. Remember that we began this series with a robe being used as evidence of Joseph's death. And then there was a garment that was used as evidence of a false accusation against Joseph. Then we see Joseph's change in position from prison and palace began with a change of clothes. And now we see clothes as part of a reconciliation of a family. Each brother is given a change of clothes. Benjamin is given 5 changes of clothes. And Joseph sends home 20 donkeys for his father, loaded up with provision. Now, do not miss the continued mention of donkeys. Remember, they feared that Joseph would steal their donkeys, and now they're going home with 20 more than they came. That is a blessing for someone. I think that was probably a God wink. Somebody was like, look at all these donkeys. Now in verse 24, Joseph tells them not to quarrel on the way. And the Hebrew text says, don't get excited, or really kind of don't get worked up. Perhaps he was worried that they would spend the whole trip pointing fingers at each other over whose fault it was that they sold Joseph. Now, verse 26 has the brothers telling their father that Joseph is alive and that he is ruler over Egypt. We began this study with them, with their severe jealousy of them and hatred. Now they're proud of him. Jacob doesn't believe them, and it says, in fact, his heart becomes numb. He was worried about the death of Benjamin and the death of Joseph and the possible death of Benjamin becoming the end of him, right? But ironically, it's the news that Joseph was still alive that sends him into shock. So he hears all this, but he still doesn't believe the brothers. But when he hears the words Joseph said, and he sees the wagons, his spirit was revived. These wagons must have been the Cadillac of all wagons, because wagons are mentioned 4 times in chapters 45 and 46. And I believe that these are proof of life for Jacob, that God has done the impossible. He has given Jacob his son back. The son he believed was dead is alive. And perhaps the wagons were significant to Jacob because they represented abundance beyond what seemed possible. God is always in the midst of impossible, and he often shows up with blessings beyond what we can imagine. And while we're called to have faith, God gives us plenty of evidence of his handiwork. Jacob isn't expected to believe Joseph by words alone, but he gives him the proof of life of these amazing wagons filled with provisions. And this is true in Jesus' resurrection too. He was resurrected. He wasn't resurrected and then immediately taken to heaven, right? He spent 40 days on earth where hundreds of people got to see him, talk to him, touch his scars. And that's because God wanted people to have proof of life, right? He gives us evidence. That's what's so amazing. He gives us a book of Bible of hundreds of years of stories of what he's done in people's lives so that we can believe, not just because of what we've heard, but because of what we've seen and what we've read. So all we have to do in our own life is just to look for God's fingerprints. He doesn't expect us to have blind faith, but rather a faith that sees. I do think it's interesting that after Jesus was resurrected, he still bore the scars. He could have had a perfect resurrected body, but he still had the scars as a reminder of what he's done for us. So now, picking up in chapter 46. So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. And then he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. So now Jacob he took his journey, and then he comes to Beersheba, and he offers sacrifices. And this is where he had journeyed away in chapter Genesis 28, when God met him in Bethel. He had just traveled away from Beersheba, and now he's going to stop here before he leaves Canaan. Both Isaac and Abraham had worshiped God at Beersheba. And Jacob's sacrifice here shows that he is worshiping the same God as his father and grandfather. He's continuing the tradition. Now, he's probably seeking reassurance about leaving Egypt since his father was told by God not to go to Egypt. And we see God speak to Jacob, and this is the last recorded speech by God to the patriarchs until God speaks to Moses at the burning bush some 430 years later. And Jacob, it says, worships the God of his father, and that's exactly how God refers to himself when he talks to Jacob. And that is just to confirm the continuation there. So now God reaffirms his promise, reassures Jacob through his promise of his presence, and then removes any doubt about his future by telling him where he would die. He says that Joseph's hand will close your eyes, and the Hebrew says, set his hand upon your eyes. And this is a reference to a custom where the eldest son or closest relative would put their hands on someone's eyes to close them after they pass away. And Jewish people still do this custom to this day. And it's just to symbolize resting in peace. So God is telling Jacob that he will die in peace. Multiple times, Jacob mentions dying and afterlife. He talks about he's going to go to the afterlife mourning. And so I just wonder if that was something that was important to him about how he was going to die or where or when, and that God was so gracious to give him that information, at least letting him know that Joseph would be with him when he died. And what an encouragement to Jacob that God would go with him. And what an encouragement this must have been for the Israelites reading this many years later when they were struggling and, throughout Judges and then such a dark time for the people of Israel, or later when they wanted a king, or when, they were under persecution, under attack, just to read these words, just like we have the same encouragement when we read it, to see that thousands of years ago, God was still present with his people as he is with us today. Now, the gods of the Near East were local gods. Canaan had Baal, Babylon had Marduk, but our God is not restricted by geography. Acts 17:24 says that God does not live in temples made by human hands, but gives life and breath to everything. Our God is personal. He's with us always. He holds our right hand just like a father does for a child. Psalm 73, 21 through 26 says, when my soul was embittered, when I was pricked in heart, I was brutish in ignorance, I was like a beast towards you. Nevertheless, I am continually with you. You hold my right hand. You guide me with your counsel, and afterwards you will receive me to glory. Whom have I in heaven but you? And there is nothing on earth that I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. So even when we're like Jacob and we are fearful or weak or show favoritism, God doesn't leave us or forsake us. He is our strength and our inheritance. And he's also holding our right hand, encouraging us to yoke ourselves to him. And that's that analogy that Jesus says. And then someday, after Jesus comes again, God will create a new Jerusalem on earth. Revelation speaks of this. And 21, it says, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. So God will dwell with us, just as he walked with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And he will restore what has been lost and establish a new Jerusalem where there will be no mourning, no crying, no pain. All right, so picking back up in verse 5, then Jacob set out from Beersheba. The sons of Israel carried Jacob their father, their little ones and their wives, in the wagons that Pharaoh had sent to carry him. They also took their livestock and their goods, which they had gained in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt, Jacob and all his offspring with him, his sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters, all his offspring he brought with them into Egypt. All right, so now I'm going to pause there because it goes into the names of the descendants of Israel who came into Egypt. And so there's a long list of names, and I will not do justice to any of them. So we're going to pick up in verse 26, and it says, all the persons belonging to Jacob who came into Egypt, who were his own descendants, not including Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2. All the persons of the house of Jacob who came into Egypt were 70. Now, notice in verse 19, it says the sons of Rachel, Jacob's wife, Joseph and Benjamin. Now, Rachel is given the title of Jacob's wife. Leah is mentioned in these verses several times, but never as Jacob's wife. And it's just interesting that they're gonna say that. Now, there are 2 numbers mentioned of how many people who came into Egypt: 66 persons, and then it says 70. And then in Acts 7:14, Stephen even says that Jacob brought 75. So this may seem like maybe an error. There's definitely a discrepancy, but it basically was based on who was doing the counting and what they actually counted. So did they count the dead sons of Judah? What about Joseph's sons that were born in Egypt? Did it include Joseph and his wife? And this is just kind of an example of that when you do have a discrepancy in the Bible, it never relates to the content or the theology. It's just who did the counting in this example. But the point is still the same. Whatever number you use, 66 or 70 or 75, the point is that Jacob began his journey as one person, and now he enters Egypt as 70. And 70 is considered a perfect number since it's a multiple of 7 and 10, which are also perfect numbers. So the narrator's use of that is representing that it's ideal or perfect. And another point is that with God, you will always end up with more than you began, not necessarily in the size of your family or by the world's standards, but definitely in your blessings and your personal growth. So picking up in verse 28, he had sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to show the way before him in Goshen, and they came into the land of Goshen. And then Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to meet Israel, his father, in Goshen. He presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. And Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive. And Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household, who were in the land of Canaan, have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. When Pharaoh calls you and says, "What is your occupation?" you shall say, "Your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers, in order that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians." So now Judah is sent ahead, signaling his leadership in the family. Joseph is reunited with his father, and he weeps on his neck for a while. Now they're to settle in Goshen. Goshen is where the Israelites will live in Egypt, separated from Egyptian culture, and this is where they're going to be allowed to flourish into a large nation. Part of the current blessing also includes preparation and protection for their future, because Canaanite culture, where they had been living, was known for absorbing other cultures and religion into it. So they would take a little bit of this and a little bit of that and create a whole new religion that then everybody would do together. But Egyptian culture included separation from people it considered abominations. Hebrew people and shepherds were considered abominations to the Egyptians. And the Hebrew word for abomination here is the highest degree of abomination. So they were seen as an inferior caste. So ultimately, this meant that they would be left alone by the Egyptians and not assimilated into their culture. And I just love this, because how often does God use what the world considers repugnant or offensive to achieve his purpose? Isaiah 53:3 in his prophecy of Jesus says, "He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised and we held him in low esteem." Wow. Jesus was like one whom people hid their faces. He was despised and rejected and held in low esteem. And yet he is the one that God is using to save all of us. And then in 1 Corinthians 1:18, it says, "The message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those of us who are being saved, it is the power of God." And this means that the gospel is going to be ridiculous or sound ridiculous to unbelievers. But to those who know Jesus, the gospel is the power of God. We are not meant to be accepted into this world. We are not meant to assimilate into this culture. This is why Canaanite culture is so dangerous, because we are meant to be set apart. Our belief in Jesus and our commitment to live counterculture will cause friction, and it will be offensive to people around us. And persecution is just evidence that people see Jesus in you. Now, we are supposed to be Christ's ambassadors, which means we're going to try to live a life that reflects Jesus to people around us. So we're going to live a life of love and grace. But and we're not going to, we shouldn't try to reach others through conflict or through confrontation, but we need to be prepared that conflict and confrontation may be what we receive in return. Just like Jesus, we are to display humility, grace, and love, but don't be surprised when we get arrogance, hatred, and persecution. Now, picking up in chapter 47. So Joseph went in and told Pharaoh, "My father and my brothers with their flocks and herds and all that they possess have come from the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen." And from among his brothers he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" And they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, as our fathers were." And they said to Pharaoh, "We have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. And now please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen." And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock." And then Joseph brought in Jacob his father and stood before him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many are the days of the years of your life?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning." And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. And then Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food according to the number of their dependents. So Joseph suggests to Pharaoh that his family live in Goshen, and Pharaoh agrees. They're given the best land and even a job because Pharaoh says, hey, if you know any able men that can watch my flocks, hey, they can be in charge of my livestock. And they're not lying because they had been shepherds and they had cared for sheep, but he's just saying, this is what tell them this is what you do, and then they will give you, he'll allow you to live in Goshen. So then Pharaoh asks Jacob how old he is. And instead of just giving him a simple number, he tells them that he has had 130 years and they have been few and evil. And the word evil can also be translated as difficult. So he's basically saying, I've had 130 years, they've been short and difficult. And I want to just spend a few minutes here and talk about his response here. He had just been reunited with the son he thought was dead. God had reassured him that he would fulfill his promises and go with him. Jacob had seen the overflowing wagons of provisions along with the wealth and prestige of Joseph. And he had just been told by Pharaoh that he could live in the best land of Egypt. And yet Jacob's response, my life has been hard and short. No exclamation of the overflow of blessings or a praise for God. Here's what he could have said. Even though I tricked my father out of my brother's blessing and I showed no remorse, both my father and God blessed me. Even though I gave God a conditional promise to follow him, God showed me unconditional love and faithfulness. Despite my favoritism towards one wife, God gave me 12 sons and a daughter. Despite my own actions, God brought reconciliation to my relationship with my brother. Despite my own failures as a father, God brought reconciliation to my family. And a son I thought was dead is alive. My years have been hard, but God has been faithful. That should have been his answer. But Jacob was caught in the spiral of comparing life to others and viewing it through the lens of this world. He said his years were few because they weren't as long as his father and his grandfather, but time means nothing to God. He says, it says in 1 Peter that we will just suffer for a little while. Now, I don't know about you, but none of my suffering has felt like a little while. But God is the God of eternity, and so our years are just a blink of an eye to him. And God doesn't view suffering as the same way that we do, right? Jacob says his days have been difficult or evil, but almost all of what he has endured has been a result of his own actions. There have been times where things were acted upon him, but he's had a hand in definitely a lot of it. Now, God will be with us, but God doesn't always rescue us from the consequences of our own actions, because it's through these consequences that we learn how to make different choices in the future. Jacob's answer shows that he doesn't understand God's plan. Now, we studied the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus and how they didn't understand God's plan and what had happened. Jesus starts walking with them, but they don't recognize them. And he asks them, what are they talking about? And they say, are you the only visitor to Jerusalem that doesn't know about Jesus, a prophet, mighty in word and deed, who was crucified? We'd hoped he'd been the one to redeem Israel. And basically they say, now we've heard accounts that his body's gone and that he might be alive. They are confused about what has happened. They don't understand God's plan. And they don't understand how what they believed could be so different than what they saw. They expected a king and got a suffering servant. Now, Jacob expected an easy and long life. He got a shorter and hard life. And yet, as we've discussed, it was way better than he admitted. His narrative was negative. And so we get to look at his life and see all the positive things that God has done. Now, in your life, you can choose to focus on what you think you've missed or what you've lost, or you can choose to see all that God has given you. We've been selling our house, and we ended up, we were on track to buy one house, and we just weren't settled about it. And so we ended up switching to a new house, and we're so excited. It costs less. We love it more. But because we switched, we're going to have a 1 week gap between when we're going to move out of our current house and move into the new house. And so I was just telling my Bible study group, I lead a Bible study of people in my neighborhood. And I was just talking to them about that. And one of the ladies was like, well, you know what you should do when you're homeless that week? You should go on a trip. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can go on a trip. That's exactly what we could do. Now, in the past, I could have been like stressed about it and I could have whiteboarded a solution and come up with all these, how are we going to do this? And we're going to not be able to live here for a week. But in that moment when she said it, it just made sense, right? I can turn an obstacle into a blessing. I can just take the narrative and turn it from something negative to something positive. So this is what we can do. We can choose joy. And we can understand too, though, that God doesn't expect us to go through life with a belief that everything is perfect, right? We don't always have to be happy and upbeat, because there will be times where we will grieve and we are sad, because we can live in hope while we sit in grief. We can live with the expectation of what God is doing while we process what we're going through. We can suffer and cry out in pain and also have peace and moments of joy. So even when we're choosing joy, that doesn't mean that we're choosing toxic positivity where we never acknowledge the tough times of our life. In Hebrews 12:2, it says that for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross and suffered the shame. And so that joy is what allowed him to go through the suffering. So you can suffer and have joy at once. But as we're going through these hard times, I just think about how in the Bible, when Mary and Martha, they had a brother Lazarus and he had died. And they had sent word to Jesus that Lazarus was sick, but he did not come in time to save him. And so when Jesus arrives at the house and Mary and Martha, they're crying, they're mourning for their brother who is gone, and they're upset with him. And they were like, if you had come in time, you could have saved him. And now Jesus is going to raise Lazarus from the dead. This is the miracle that he is about to do. But he doesn't, when they're crying and they are talking to him about kind of their accusation of you could have saved him, he doesn't come to them and say, listen, stop crying. Let me tell you what I'm about to do. He sees their grief and he sees their pain, and he just stops and he weeps with them. It's where Jesus says Jesus wept. He just has compassion. And that's what he does for us in our lives. He's not looking at us saying, Jamie, why are you upset and why are you crying? Get your act together. He just wraps his arms around us and he just holds us. And he's just, my child, my child. And so even when we're going through those hard times, Jesus is still with us, loving us through it all. Now, one last thing before we move on. Notice that Jacob blesses Pharaoh. Usually the superior blesses the inferior. By Egyptian standards, Pharaoh would have been superior, and yet here Jacob is the one blessing Pharaoh. Now, picking up in verse 13. Now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by the reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they had bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone. And Joseph answered, give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. He supplies them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. And when that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, we will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herds of livestock are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh, and give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. And then Joseph said to the people, behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your household, and as food for your little ones. And they said, you have saved our lives. May it please my Lord, we will be servants to Pharaoh. So Pharaoh made a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, If now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. And he answered, I will do as you have said. And he said, Swear to me. And he swore to him. And then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. So now look at verses 12 and 13. Joseph provides food for his family, and then in the next sentence, we're reminded that there isn't enough food in the land and the people are struggling. And yet Joseph's family has plenty of food. And verse 27 says they were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And this brings to mind Genesis 1:28, where God told Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. It also brings in God's promise to Abraham that his descendants would become a great nation. And here's the contrast too. While the Egyptian people were selling off all their property and ultimately themselves in exchange for food, Israel and his sons gained possessions and were fruitful. The Egyptians languished, and yet the Israelites flourished. Never doubt God's ability to give you abundance, even in the midst of famine. Now, in our homework, we discussed that Jacob lived in Egypt for 17 years, the same number of years that Joseph lived with his family. So Joseph lived under Jacob's care for 17 years, and then Jacob lived under Joseph's care for 17 years. It's just such a nice bookend for the story. Now, Israel has Joseph promised that he will not bury him in Egypt. God had told him that he would bring him back to this land, and Joseph will follow through on that promise. And so he's going to take him back to Egypt, and he's going to bring him to the burying place. And so in the next few weeks, we're going to continue to study now after Jacob has lived in the land for 17 years, and just to see his perspective in comparison to where we are now, and see if he gets to a place of peace and positivity. So let us pray. Our dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for this time together. We thank you for your word. We thank you for the encouragement of how you are our provider, that even in a famine that we have abundance, Lord. May we always look around and see our lives through a lens of joy and expectation, Lord. We thank you for all the blessings in your name. Amen.